failure rates when those things are being used, when those failure rates are being used in critical applications. I'm Chris O'Brien, and I'm a partner with Exida. I've been with Exida 10 years, and prior to that I worked in an automation company and a reserve power backup company, and I have been doing this for over 25 years, so hopefully can provide a little bit of insight and guidance on the topic. A little background on Exida for those who don't know us too well. We're a specialty consulting and certification body that helps customers with high availability and high reliability system designs. We work with our customers in a couple different ways. At the base, we work with them on developing knowledge and training and providing information through books and webinars. We also help customers with lifecycle services, whether that's analysis and design reviews for OEMs or functional safety services for end users. We help in many customers in that way. And finally, we do assessments to most of the main functional safety standards and cybersecurity standards, including IEC 61508 and IEC 61511. We have offices around the world, and fortunately have customers and resources lined up. So what prompted us to put this webinar together is that we're seeing Exida and major end users that we work with are seeing an increase in the number of what we would call unrealistic failure rates being used in safety critical calculations. And this can kind of result in one of two negative outcomes. The first outcome is if the projects or the end users have a formal validation process, then when these results are reviewed by internal experts at the end users or a third party such as Exida, they'll fail. The FSA2, Functional Safety Assessment 2, which is in the IEC 61511 safety lifecycle after the design is complete, would find these, or if there's not an FSA2, the Functional Safety Assessment 3, which is required by 61511, and it's required to be performed before the hazards are present, would find these optimistic numbers or unrealistic numbers and require a redesign or some type of mitigation before the plant could be started up. Now, we've got firsthand experience from end users who have had to go through this, where they've stopped projects, and we have indications where we've seen it, and we have indications and know where other third parties have found discrepancies in the safety life cycle and not allowed plants to start. For projects that don't have a formal validation process, these designs will get into service and essentially result in dangerous under-design of the safety functions. And we'll go through these two options in a little more detail. In thinking about the best way to really try to drive this home, we've come up with really just asking the question, could you pass the red face test? So for those who may not be familiar with this term, it's an idiom. Essentially it means it's a test of a person's embarrassment if they had to explain what they did. Often used if you were explaining to a lawyer what you did and why you did it, would this cause you no embarrassment and you'd be perfectly confident and comfortable saying I did A, B, and C, here's why, and to the best of my ability and knowledge I thought it was correct at the time and hopefully still think it's correct today? Or would you have undue embarrassment and blush basically because you in your gut or you consciously knew you really weren't meeting all the requirements, and you were just relying on a third-party piece of paper to say it's covered. So I think that's really a critical point we need to talk about, because those of us working on these safety systems, whether we're designing products, or we're designing systems, or we're running plants, we're really designing these things or reviewing these things to say, for the most dangerous things in the plant, these systems we've designed are sufficient. And that's a lot of responsibility we take when we're doing this. So, example, an engineer uses a failure rate from a certificate for a solenoid. The failure rate is listed as 0.47 fits, dangerous. So the red face test is this failure rate equates to one dangerous failure every 242,000 years. So that means if you had a population of 242,000 solenoids, you would only expect one dangerous failure per year out of that entire population. So the question is, could you explain to a court of law why you felt this was a valid number? Example 2. An engineer uses a failure rate supplied by a manufacturer that states a motor contactor has a total dangerous failure rate of 5 fits and 99% diagnostic coverage. This equates to one dangerous undetected failure rate every 2.2 million years. That means if you had 2.2 million motor contactors in service, you would expect only one dangerous failure per year that wasn't detected by an automatic diagnostic. So could you explain to a court why you felt, one, that this was a valid failure rate, and two, what diagnostics are built into a motor contactor? And as I'm sure most people on the call, on the webinar, realize, a motor contactor is contacts that are made or broken by energizing a coil that pulls back a movable piece. The only way to test that is with a proof test. So unless they were frequently, daily, de-energizing and re-energizing that contactor, there would be no way to know if the dominant failure mode, which would be welding of contacts for dangerous, occurred. So the number is, as we can see, by 2.2 million years, unrealistic, and the concept of a automatic diagnostic, and that's what a diagnostic means. In 61508, a diagnostic is an automatic test that's performed to detect a dangerous failure and enunciate it. Example 3, an engineer uses a failure rate from a certificate that shows a valve body has a safe failure fraction of 90%. So the red face test is, this explicitly means there's inherent failures in the valve body, or that there is a high degree of diagnostic coverage. Could you explain to a court what the safe failure modes of your valve were, or what built-in diagnostics there were? So obviously, except in the very rare case when a valve is used in a fail open, or the safe state is fail open, then there's not a safe failure mode for a valve that needs to close on trip, and in a valve body there absolutely are no built-in diagnostics. So these examples are real examples, and they're only a small fraction of what we see. And when we're out working with end users, because the industry has moved far enough that even major end users want independence from their own teams to come in and review designs on these critical systems. These end users relay to us that they see these same issues where they're getting unrealistic designs based on unrealistic failure rate numbers. So an important thing to realize is functional safety is no longer a best practice, it's expected engineering stewardship. So those of us who are involved in these safety critical systems have a responsibility as engineers to design them to current standards and best of our ability. You might have been able to argue 15 years ago that, well, these are new standards, people aren't really using them, we'll see if they're helpful. That train has left the station. They are used in many industries by the vast majority of customers in those different industries, and it's not a nice to have anymore, it's a must have. So if we look at what the standards are trying to do, really through the process and techniques, they're trying to build what we call a bridge to safety. So you've got the main peers here, which are functional safety planning, systematic failure protection, random failure protection, and you've got all these cables with the individual steps of the safety life cycle. When we use unrealistic data in an analysis, it leads to unsafe designs because it will drive insufficient redundancy or insufficient testing. And at the end of the day, what happens is the required risk reduction for the plant is not reached because not all the steps in the safety life cycle have been executed in a reasonable way. There's a legal responsibility that comes with this as well. So design engineers need to demonstrate they're using a reasonable level of expertise or judgment. EPCs need to provide adequate training and controls for their people doing these designs. OEMs need to supply data that is suitable for the application the devices are going to be used in. So many devices, so a solenoid could be used on a bottling line and could be cycling every couple seconds, or it could be used in a refinery where it's going to sit for 12 or 24 or 36 months and not cycle. The failure modes and the failure rates of those two different applications are dramatically different. And it's incumbent on the OEM to understand what people are assuming in the use of the product, and it's incumbent on the users of this data to understand the assumptions that the OEM have placed. And then finally, the asset owner is responsible. Are they implementing and maintaining an acceptable process safety management program? And then if anybody thinks that these issues, unfortunately, we know with a large number of plants, large number of systems, there will be accidents. And if anybody thinks that these types of things don't wind up in court, that's wishful thinking. We can look at the Buncefield Depot explosion in the UK. We can look at the BP Horizon oil spill. We can look at the Toyota acceleration issue. All of those, when they were dug into, were traced back to equipment not working as designed or engineering process not being correct. And on the Toyota one, it was reviewed and the software architecture and software development process of Toyota was deemed not to meet acceptable engineering standards, and it can be seen by Toyota settling a case with the U.S. Department of Transportation for a several billion-dollar fine, and Toyota losing jurid cases for neglect in the U.S. courts brought by individuals. So it isn't a matter of what would these things will ever wind up in a court. Unfortunately, it's only a matter of when. When will they? So here's the problem statement. How's an engineer trying to do their best to know what's acceptable? Proposed solution. You need a structured methodology. Propose 6 gates. Competency. What is the assessment body? What's the details of the assessment report? Is the data valid? What modeling method are you using? And what are you doing as far as life cycle assessments? So let's start with competency, and I've got that as gate 0 because you don't really get to start if you don't have the competency requirements in place. So 61511 clearly requires competency, and right from the standard, persons, departments, or organizations involved in safety lifecycle activities shall be competent to carry out the activities for which they are accountable. Sounds good. Competency involves more than just knowing how to perform SIL verification calculations. A lot of focus has been made on correct calculations, what techniques, and that's important. You don't want to use oversimplified techniques. You want to make sure you're accounting for everything that needs to be done. But being able to run a calculation is only part of it. At a minimum addition to that, a sound understanding of what the failure modes, what are diagnostics, and what testing is necessary for the devices used in these safety systems is required. Now, the SIL verification can be performed by a team or reviewed by a team, not expecting one individual to know everything, but it isn't just a matter of taking a certificate or taking a number from an OEM, putting it into a tool, and calculating a number. That would be equivalent to a carpenter who knows how to use the nail gun, having somebody tell him that, oh, you can use a 2x4 for a floor joist, and he goes, oh, I've got a piece of paper that says I can use a 2x4 for a floor joist, and I know how to put joists in, so I've built a sound floor. It's just not reasonable, and it's not defendable. Gate number 2 would be who's providing the data or the assessment that that product is suitable for use in a safety system. Sometimes there's no information. Sometimes there's an OEM Self Declaration. Sometimes there's a third-party house cert, and sometimes it's by an accredited third party. So let's look at each of these. So the first, if there's no formal assessment, then all of the responsibility falls on the end user to justify the use of that device. It doesn't you could buy it from a system integrator, you could order a plant from an EPC. At the end of the day, who's ever running that plant, if there's no other justification, is inherently saying they're going to support it or say it's suitable based on a proven in use argument. And there's a provision for that, but most people who are doing it probably haven't really internalized what risk they're accepting. So the standard says you need to look at manufacturer quality and management systems. You have to adequately identify and track the devices or systems. You have to demonstrate the performance of the components and subsystems in similar operating profiles, and you have to have a volume of operating experience. So who's ever using stuff based on proven in use, the end user ultimately has to review this and agree that, and basically take the responsibility to say the devices are suitable for use in their safety systems. Another thing is OEM Self Declaration. So some OEMs have issued certificates and self-declared they meet a SIL level. So the OEM must demonstrate competency and independence. The competency is not in the product development of what they're doing, but in functional safety to the standards of 61508 and 61511. And the independence, which there's guidance in 61508 for independence. So for SIL 1, you need an independent person. For SIL 2, you need an independent department. For SIL 3, you need an independent organization. So independent is by means of management and financing. So the vice president of engineering is not independent. He might be an independent person if they're going for SIL 1, but he's certainly not an independent department to review a company's products. And he may or may not have the competency for 61508 requirements. And if somebody's claiming SIL 3, then they're almost certainly not going to be an independent organization inside the same company attesting that their product is suitable. Third case is what's called a third-party house certificate. Now, a house certificate is when an independent organization issues a certificate based on their reputation and self-declared expertise. So what that means is there's many organizations out there that have been accredited to the international certification standard, which we'll get to in a second, which is the IEC 17025 or IEC 17065, and that's an important standard, but that standard basically talks about how to run a certification program, which would cover things such as impartiality, storing of documents, availability of data for review, but it has nothing to do with reviewing the actual technical scheme or capability of an organization to issue a certificate against a given standard. So these are called house certificates. They're basically done by the reputation and goodwill of the third party that's issuing them. And you'll see on, like, for example, here's a certificate. There's no accreditation body. So an accreditation body is the national body within any given country that's authorized to accredit certified bodies. And they basically audit and accredit a certified body. They will ensure as a minimum that the certification programs requirements such as 17025 I just mentioned and 17065 are met. But they'll also look at certification schemes if they list those on the standard. So for example, exida is accredited by ANSI, which is the U.S. liaison body, and we're accredited as a certified body for cybersecurity and functional safety. ANSI is a member of the International Accreditation Forum, so it's got mutual recognition around the world. And not only are we accredited to the certification scheme, the 170 schemes, but our technical schemes for each of the standards we're certified for are also reviewed and accredited by the certified body. So we have written schemes for 61511, 61508, the things we need to review and how we do that. So you need to look at where you're getting the data and what data, and basically what data you're getting. Gate 2 would be then the assessment report. Regardless of who says the device is suitable, there should be some documentation for it. So this is just a sample of one assessment report, and we list in there the product, what's usable, and then the methodology, including all the different aspects of the product or process that are reviewed. Functional safety management, specifications, the design process, the validation activities, the verification activities, the modification activities, the documentation to the end user, the quality system, as well as the hardware and architecture. So failure rates are a critical part of all of this, but they're only one part of the things that need to be reviewed. Now, we've had it where we've seen what we would call unrealistic failure rates from a third party and asked the user to go back and get, could they provide the information? Maybe we're misunderstanding. Maybe there's some application criteria we don't see, or it's not similar to what we've experienced. And the end users have gotten a response that that's confidential information and will not be shared. Well, it's true that OEMs certainly have the right to protect confidential information, but if we look at these types of things, saying a list of the quality manual or a list of or an example of how the failure rates were determined, really doesn't qualify as confidential. And in 17065, it states that as a minimum, the certification body shall provide information upon request about the validity of a given certification. Now you could say, well, they just need to answer whether it's valid or not, but it really, if we want transparency and we realize we're using these in the most critical systems in a plant, some justification as to why the process, the equipment manufacturer's process and the failure rates are valid is a reasonable expectation. Gate 3 would be data validity. What I tell people is convert the failure rates and fits that you're given to mean time to failure, and then say, is this a reasonable number? Is one failure in 2 million years reasonable? Probably not. Is one failure in 200,000 years reasonable? Probably not. Is one failure in 10,000 years reasonable? Probably not. So that's a really good way, because fits are kind of obscure. We don't deal with it every day. It's kind of a good way to get a real quick check and say, wow, if I had a population of 10,000 valve assemblies, do I think I'd have more or less than one failure per year? Oh, I'd have more, and kind of work through that logical, just simple everyday question. And then imagine if you were trying to testify why you felt one failure in 200,000 years was reasonable. I just don't think most people with process experience would think that's credible. Another thing you can do is you can compare failure rates to known sources. So what we have here is we have a chart of about 20 different assemblies of FMEDA's exodus done. We have a final solenoid actuator valve combination built out of third-party certificates that adds up to about 45 fits, and then we have ARETA data, which is a very widely known and respected database for failure rate data, and you can see there's a pretty big span of data. So can you explain the difference? We spent a lot of time looking at ARETA, understanding what goes in there, meeting with the ARETA group, and the difference between what we'd say FMEDA, but I wouldn't even just say FMEDA, I'd say failure rates used in functional safety applications on ARETA are this. One, ARETA by design includes all failures. It could be customer abuse, it could be a random failure, it could be an end-of-life failure. They're included in ARETA data. ARETA does not account for a safety life cycle by definition. So in 61511, there's requirements for properly testing and make sure the loop works before you are running it in the process. So you should find any incorrect designs or initial failures at that point. There's also a requirement to change out components before the end of their life. So as far as wear-out failures, there shouldn't be any, because by definition, in the safety life cycle, you don't do that. And ARETA is also a relatively small sample size, so when you put confidence factors on it, it increases the number. So the exida data tends to be maybe a third of what the ARETA data is, but there's some pretty valid reasons for the differences. If we look at this house cert point based to exida, it's 40 times lower than exida, which means it's about 120 times lower than ARETA. Now, if there were valid reasons that, hey, in this application, it's a specially designed product in this application with, more than typical process industry safety factors, or we have a much more benign application, there could be reasons to justify a lower number, but somebody needs to go through that and document it, and then the designers need to agree and the ultimate end user needs to agree that that's valid for their application. One thing that we often hear is that an FMEDA, which is a technique laid out in 61508, it's a predictive model. You build it up from a component database and you model a device, and that sometimes people call that an academic exercise. Well, I think that's probably pretty far from reality. Every time we do an assessment, we do a field failure study of that device and compare it to an FMEDA. So here's an actual example of a solenoid. So in this one, there were over 2 billion hours of device data. We had failure rates, we had failure modes for the field study. The proven in use analysis would say this device has a failure rate of 57 fits. The FMEDA said predicted 88 fits. We would say that's good correlation, and we would want the FMEDA to be a little bit conservative because there's uncertainty in the data in the return. And we've collected over 2 billion operational hours from field failure studies and correlated that to our component failure database. So we know because we work with all different groups around the world, but we've not found any other data source that comes anywhere near this level of rigor and size as far as analysis. So FMEDAs are not an academic exercise. They're an engineering model to predict the performance of new devices based on the performance of past devices. The fourth gate would be looking at the modeling method. So there's some key things that need to be considered. First, failure rates are important, failure modes and the coverage. Second, the mission time for the system. Third, the proof test interval. Fourth, proof test effectiveness, proof test duration, mean time to restore, redundancy of devices, operations, and maintenance. And just as a quick example, overestimating proof test performance can move your achieved SIL level by at least one level. So as you factor all of the parameters in that drive reliability, safety reliability, you've got to put them in an accurate model and you've got to do a complete modeling. This is really where the effective optimistic data can be seen. Now this is a different analysis I did about a year and a half ago, different devices than I used in these examples, but the total dangerous failure rates for those devices selected by one end user were 12 fits, which means for the valve assembly, solenoid, actuator, and valve, they were not knowingly, but essentially saying, hey, if we had 9,400 valve assemblies, we'd only have one dangerous issue a year. And doing that, you can see that the valve had the least contribution to PFD average of anything in the loop, which for people familiar with process applications realize that's really not what's going to happen. The valve is probably going to dominate. They achieved a risk reduction of 780. They had SIL2 with no redundancy and no diagnostic requirements. That's not realistic. If we remodel this with more reasonable numbers, we get maybe 1,300 fits for the whole assembly, maybe 87 years mean time to failure, and we made SIL1, which is fine, that's good, that's very good, and that could be improved by either redundancy or implementing things such as partial valve stroke test as a diagnostic. So, and we see up here in this, the final element is now the major contributor to the PFD average. Why this is so important is that optimistic data or unrealistic data essentially leads to unsafe designs. We have to always be grounded in, these are not analyses to be done. This is deciding or designing what are the functions that are going to go on, what we have already identified as the most dangerous parts of the plant. So a safety instrumented system works to automatically take the process to a safe state when conditions are violated, permits the process to move forward if conditions are met, or takes an action to mitigate a hazard. So there, it's the last place in the plant, if there were any place at all, this would be the last place in the plant you would want to be optimistic on data. And then finally, the implementation of safety lifecycle assessments is a good way to make sure you're not missing something. So FSA 3 as a minimum is required by 61511, and that's a functional safety assessment prior to the hazard being present, after the systems are designed, installed, but prior to the hazard. The same level of competence and independence is needed to perform these assessments as is needed to perform a 61508 assessment. And so the questions are, do you have a functional safety management plan in place? Are you performing the required functional safety assessments as either designer and builders of the plants or operators of the plants? And there's kind of 5 places that the standard talks about the assessments being performed. 1 would be after conceptual design. 2 is after detailed design, typically right after the FAT. The required one that must always be done is prior to startup, and then you can have one after modifications or one before commissioning or decommissioning. So that's a proposed maybe 6 gates to try to improve the overall design and actually achieving the required risk reductions. So I'd like to open it up for questions at this time. So you can type questions in. There should be a place that you can type in questions. I have a panel, but I don't see any questions. Okay, I'll give it another minute to see if anybody has any questions. Oh. So the question toolbar is working because somebody said no questions so far, which is good. I'm glad at least the question option is working. We will be posting this, the recording, and the PDF will be available for download. So, and you can obviously reach out to me or anybody at Exida with additional questions if you think of some. Oh, here's one. So here's one. One valve manufacturer claims FMEDA is not open to review due to confidentiality. So they might be saying, listen, we don't want to give you our cross-sectional drawings and we don't want to give you our detailed FMEDA, but there should be an FMEDA report where they're summarizing the failures, and at least there should be the source of the data, what data was used in that analysis. So for example, exida publishes a component reliability handbook, which shows at least the failure rate for valve parts. So you could look up like, oh, they use 630, for example, in a ball valve, the ball is 630 fits, and that's split between binding, minor leakage, and major leakage. So you could look at, oh, they used reasonable failure rates for the parts, they use reasonable failure modes, and I can kind of see how they get up to the total. Now, if there's a number and you look at it, and that's the exact case that I had where it was a number much, much lower than we've really seen anywhere, and they said, oh, we can't share anything with you. And at that point, I would be uncomfortable accepting a number that was widely different without knowing all the assumptions that went into it. Here's one. Would someone from a company's corporate engineering office being considered as an independent enough from a project team to conduct an FSA? I would say yes, probably, because normally if the project team was kind of at the plant level and then corporate engineering reported up differently and they were coming in, I think so. And often the highest level, you probably wouldn't meet the independent organization requirement unless it was pretty well segmented, but you certainly would meet an independent department. And in reality, the vast majority of SIFs in a plant are going to be SIL 2 or SIL 1 or even SIL A, so that's a reasonable approach. One thing we have seen though, and we're seeing more of, is though large companies reaching out to parties such as exida to come in and help with their SIL 3 or their highest risk things to be another, in one case they've hired an engineering firm to do the analysis, they've got their internal team, and they've hired exida to come in and do the third-party review just because the risks are so high. But I think that, to the question from Michael, that I think that's reasonable. Now, if it's an OEM, unless it's, I'm assuming what was an end user and an OEM, if those like local engineering teams kind of report up to the central engineering, then you probably still would have a hard SIL 2 requirement or limit. Question on slide 33, dimension of the x-axis. Those were just different counts of the different devices that were looked at to spread the data out. It was just counting device 1 to n for slide 31. We'll make the somebody asked about the PDF, that will be available. Another question, is it appropriate to use generic data when determining SIL calculations? It can be. So the benefit of generic data would be, and the reality is not everything has an FMEDA, or not every type of device might be available certified. So if you could get, and exida publishes generic data, and we're working on we're in the middle of kind of a major research thing where we're going to be publishing not only a generic data but a distribution, min, max, mean, as well as the quartiles of where the data falls as far as failure rates. So that would be a very reasonable approach to use in the PFD calculation, and then that's supported by a review of quality systems and manufacturing systems, and maybe even shipments and returns of the data, as well as plant experience, can build a reasonable justification for a device. Here's a question, how can you integrate the SIL study within the HAZOP study in a fast way? You need calculations that can't be made when the HAZOP study is working. How can it be possible? So I think that question is basically, we're doing our HAZOPs, we're trying to determine if we have enough safeguards, but we haven't designed the SIFs, so we don't know what the number is. So one way might be to have some typical designs. If you've got a plant, or if you're an engineering contractor where Well, typically we know for pressure or temperature or flow, we could have, here's what a SIL 1 design looks like, here's what a SIL 2 design looks like. Could we get to a SIL 3 if needed? So maybe having typical designs documented, so if you do claim them as a safeguard, then you have some reasonability, or if you've already got them, if it's an existing plan and you have some SIFs there, but nobody ever did SIL verification, what the HAZOP could do is flag that we think we're okay, but we need a detailed LOPA and SIL verification to confirm that the assumptions we made in the HAZOP are accurate. I think it is an issue that it's doing that analysis takes some time, so having them instantly available during a HAZOP may not be too practical. Here's a question: does the data on supplier returns pass the red face test? Many final elements stick and fail dangerously, but are not returned to the manufacturer, but recreased and returned to service. So that's why I would say no. They wouldn't. Manufacturers, I think, honestly, but what they don't know is what happens in between. So we always treat the field return data as a minimum level, which we mean that it's not going to, the real performance is never ever going to be better than that calculation. But we also limit the calculation to, depending on the device, we limit it to what's the likelihood it's going to be returned. If it's an expensive custom valve, the valve manufacturer is probably going to definitely know about it in the first little bit of time. If it's a solenoid where it's frankly more expensive to return it than just to put a new one in, the solenoid supplier isn't going to know about it. And then we'll typically limit it to only knowing about it for the first year of operation. So we kind of try to take those factors into account, but we only ever use it to calculate a minimum. And that's also why if a valve manufacturer has been shipping, say, 1,000 valves for the last 20 years and they've gotten a handful back, they're going to take typically an OEM perspective, and it's the right perspective for an OEM, is they would take the hours for every, hey, this valve's been out there for 20 years, this valve's been out there for 19, we have 1,000 out there for 20 years, 1,000 out there for 19, 1,000 out there for 18, and so on and so on. So the field operational time gets to be very large, and the returns are very small, and they get unrealistic numbers. They're based on something, but they're not really based on complete information. So that is, to use those numbers without some type of checking and validation, I would say doesn't pass a red face test. But basically, the person who is using those numbers and arguing would have to be comfortable they did. Another question back to the HAZOP. I don't quite understand it about a way to integrate the calculations and predictions for a DCS, but yeah, I'm not quite sure I understand. I apologize, I don't quite understand the question. So another question was about calculating failure rates for proven and use components, and I would go back to kind of taking a generic data and saying this is similar to other valves of this type. We're going to use generic number, and we're going to do additional looking at the process. And I'm sorry, I don't understand your last question. So if you could rephrase it or send me an email, maybe we can get you some additional information. All right, I think the questions, those are great questions. So again, we will post the recording and a PDF of this on our website, and you'll get, everybody who attended will get a link to it. So thank you very much, and hope you have a great day. Take care.